Today in this video, we're going to be checking out Dehancer for DaVinci Resolve. This is a film emulation plugin that helps you get that classic analog film look with your footage. Now I'm going to demonstrate for you how to set up and configure Dehancer in your project, depending on the type of project that you are currently working on, because there's different ways of doing it. And then we're also going to take a look at a color grade. I'm going to color grade some footage from start to finish using Dehancer and take you on a tour of all the different features and capabilities of the software. In full disclosure, this video is not paid for, it's not sponsored. Dehancer hasn't had any involvement in this video at all, outside of just providing me with a plugin, a copy of the plugin for DaVinci Resolve. After I made that last review about the still photography plugin, they reached back out to me and they said, hey, would you like to check out the video version? I said, yeah, of course. So they shared the plugin with me, and I've been experimenting with it quite a bit. And I think it's pretty awesome. I think it's a really interesting plugin, especially if you are a fan of film emulation and getting some of that character and some of that look in your footage. So without further ado, let's jump into DaVinci and take a look. So here we are in DaVinci Resolve, and as you can see out here at the end of my node graph, at the end of my color grade, I have the Dehancer effect applied to the last serial node. Now this is actually what Dehancer recommends. They recommend that the Dehancer effect be applied to the last serial node. It should be applied at the very end of your color grade. All other color grading work that you do should be handled upstream of the Dehancer effect. If you wanted to apply, say, like a sharpening effect on top, something like that, then it would be appropriate then to have a serial node and some additional changes after Dehancer. But in general, you want everything to come beforehand. Now, in order to get good output from Dehancer, it is critically important that it receives the correct input. And what is correct will really depend on your project. It will depend on the type of footage that you are color grading, and it will depend on you and your workflow and how you typically work. So let me just show you what I'm talking about here. So when you add Dehancer to a serial node, you'll see up here at the top of the effect panel that there is this input drop down. And this is where you're able to choose the source input, like what it is that Dehancer is receiving, so that Dehancer knows what to do with it. And right now I have this set to DaVinci Resolve Wide Gamut Intermediate, which matches my project settings. And this is probably pretty standard, I would think, for most people these days. I have my color science set to DaVinci YRGB Color Managed, and then my color processing mode is set to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And so now, for this particular type of project, it is configured correctly. But what about a non-color managed project? Well, let's take a look at that. So if I come back up here to project settings, and I'm going to set this back to DaVinci YRGB, and we're going to use Rec 709 Scene as the timeline color space. Then what we need to do is come back up here to input. We need to change this to Rec 709. And now we need to transform this footage into the Rec 709 color space before it reaches Dehancer. Now there's another way to do this, which is rather interesting. Dehancer actually has built-in log to Rec 709 profiles. And these profiles are different than the Rec 709 profiles that are built into DaVinci, and they are different from the manufacturer's profiles as well. These are custom-made camera profiles that DaVinci made in order to get, in their words, because I reached out to them and asked them about this, they made these in order to get better aesthetic results, in order to get better looking log footage when it is converted into Rec 709 that is more appropriate for the purposes of film emulation. Which is better? Well, it kind of depends on, the project you're working on. It depends on your color grading workflow, your process, how you like to work. But the thing that I would definitely recommend doing is giving these built-in camera profiles a try, because they are different. You will get a different look from them than you would using the built-in color space transform in DaVinci, and a different look from using a manufacturer's log to Rec 709 LUT as well. Whenever you use any kind of LUT or any kind of plugin, it's always a good idea, to do any kind of technical adjustments that you need to do to the footage in order to get it into a better baseline, a better, more optimized state. The thing I noticed from looking at this footage is that I feel like it's skewing a little bit warm, like it's just a little too warm, I think. I'm just going to pull back on the color temperature here a little bit, push it a little bit cooler, and then maybe pull out a little bit of magenta. Not much, just a little bit. And basically just, like looking at, the flowers in her hair here and the dress to see when we get this somewhat neutral. And I feel like that looks pretty good. So let me just disable this on and off, and you can definitely see the difference. Okay, so let's begin our color grade. And the thing that I want to choose is I want to choose Fuji Pro 400H, because I feel like that is the look. Fuji Pro 400H has always been a rather popular film, especially in the wedding photography world. It just has that nice pastel kind of look. It looks really nice with skin tones. And I feel like the emulation that they have here in Dehancer looks really, really nice and will give us a good baseline to be working from. So after choosing a film stock, the next thing to experiment with is the push-pull EV slider here. This allows you to emulate the appearance of film when pushed and pulled. Some of the effect here is rather subtle, especially because I haven't added any additional contrast yet. But you can see that when we push the exposure of Fuji Pro 400H, the colors get a little bit softer, a little more neutral than they are when just shooting at regular exposure. So if you are, someone who is a film enthusiast and you like to push and pull film, Dehancer has provided additional versions of each film emulation here to emulate the appearance of those film stocks when pushed and pulled. Okay, the next step down is expand. And this is where you're able to assign the black point and the white point of the footage and, have some control over the dynamic range. And you can see that we're pretty well filling out the dynamic range here. And, we have some pretty deep blacks in the bow tie here, some pretty bright whites. So it's pretty well filled out. The one thing I might want to do is just push the highlights a little bit more. I want to bring those up some just so that we get just a little more light to be working with later on when we start applying some additional contrast. Okay, the next option down is print. Now, the interesting thing about film emulation in Dehancer is that film emulation is a two-step process. First, there is the emulation of the film itself, like the actual tangible color negative. Then there is the second step, which is how that film appears when printed. Now, because we're using a photography film, which is Fuji Pro 400H, we should choose Kodak Endura Glossy Paper. And notice how much of a change that makes with regards to contrast and the tonality of the image. It just adds a little bit more punch. And now the image, I think, is beginning to look a little more like, what you would expect, what you visualize Fuji Pro 400H to look like. Then inside of print, we have options here for target white point. And this is something you'd use with Kodak 2383 print film. And then we have options for exposure, contrast, color density, and saturation. These are all meant to emulate a traditional film darkroom developing process. One of the options in here that I find really interesting is color density. Now, let me just zoom in here so we can get a good look at this. Now, pay attention to the red jacket here. When I lift color density and drop color density, you see how the burgundy in his jacket just gets a little bit deeper and a little bit darker. And this is one of the interesting and defining characteristics of film and the differences between film and print and the modern, like a digital world of, digital photo and video editing. Because on a screen, on an RGB screen, colors are additive, whereas, in the analog world, they are subtractive. Colors get darker as they become more saturated, whereas in a digital workflow, colors get brighter when they're more saturated. So one of the things that really gives film like its film look and the appearance of film is how dense the colors are. And notice this if you ever watch a film that's actually been shot on film, you'll notice that the colors are deeper and richer. It's not like saturation as you think of saturation from like a digital world, but rather it just has like a deeper, darker kind of look to it. Okay, so I don't feel like I need to do much here. I don't want to crank up color density too much because I don't want to affect skin tone negatively. But I do want to add a little bit of contrast. So I just want to make the image a little less flat and bring out the subjects a little bit more. And I think I want to add just a touch of exposure too, just to kind of compensate for that contrast adjustment that I made. Next up, we have color head, which, may sound a little bit weird, especially if you don't know what this is referring to, but a color head, as you may know if you have any experience in a darkroom, a color head is where you're able to introduce color to light when a print is being made. Usually that print, or rather the light that is used, is neutral, but by adding color, you're able to affect the color of the print that you are making. And this again works in a subtractive way. So if you are making a photography print and you wanted more green in the print and to pull some of that magenta out, you would actually add magenta light. Think about colors on the color wheel, right? You would add magenta light in order to be introducing more green into the image, because we're talking about subtractive color processing here. So the way that color head works in Dehancer is that it emulates the behavior of that color head. And that's why we have, 3 sliders here and the ability to gang all 3 of them together as well, and to be raising and lowering their value. Creatively, I feel like it's still like a little magenta-ish, a little warmish, and I kind of want it to have more of that bluish green Fuji look, and to kind of feel like more like a forest, because I want more green in the shot. Okay, so next up we're going to bring back some of that grain that we disabled earlier, and you can see how much of a difference grain makes, not only in just adding some texture to the image, but it also softens the highlights, brings those down a little bit, lifts the blacks as well, and so it affects contrast and exposure too, in addition to providing some texture. Now the interesting thing about grain in Dehancer, or one of the interesting things, is that the grain is rather kind of clumpy and imperfect, and more closely emulates the appearance of grain in actual film, as opposed to like mathematically precise grain like you would get in a digital workflow. It has more of an analog character to it. In addition to typical controls of being able to control how big the grain is and how much of it is and all that, you're also able to selectively target where the grain should go. So it's not like a blanket uniform grain across everything like you would get by using an overlay grain, but rather you can target exactly where you want it. So you could just put grain into your highlights, a little bit less into your midtones, and maybe protect some of the detail in your shadows by only applying a little bit of grain there, or maybe not at all. I mean, it's kind of up to you. That way you're able to more precisely control exactly which tonal region the grain appears in. Then down here at the bottom, we have some film types. These are actually added since my review of the photography plugin. We have a negative film grain type and a positive film grain type. And these emulate how grain would look, say, in like a negative film stock, where it looks a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier, as opposed to to a more clean grain that you would get from a positive slide film. So you can mess around with that. There's also an option here for analog, or more of a digital, more of a mathematically precise looking grain, if that's what you're after. But I prefer to keep it on analog. So far, let me just come back out and take a look. And I feel like that little bit of grain just really helped give it a little more texture, and it's starting to look really good. Okay, the next option down is halation. Now, halation is, like a natural byproduct of film, where bright highlights develop a kind of like a reddish glow, like there's a little bit of extra magenta around their edge. It's one of the unique things that you may not notice immediately, but it's a kind of a subliminal thing. It just adds a little bit of extra magenta, like a little bit of red around some of the highlights, and really makes them glow. I really like what's happening with her hair here, how it just starts to look a little less yellow, a little less gray, and it starts to introduce a little bit of red and starts to make them just look a little bit warmer. And, this is something that you can dial up or dial down, however much you want. But I do like, just that little extra bit of, reddish tint that it gives some of the highlights. I think it's a really nice effect. So I think for this, I'm going to keep it in. Okay, the next effect down is bloom. Now this emulates the appearance of, say, like a diffusion mist filter or a bloom filter, where it just amplifies the highlights and just gives it, just a little more volume. Personally, I'm not that crazy about the glowing effect. I don't really care for it all that much. I think it looks, I don't know. I guess it depends on the type of footage you're editing. Like maybe if you're really going for like some kind of dream sequence or something, then it would look good, but I don't know. For me personally, I just don't particularly care for it. So I don't use bloom quite as much. And then next up we have Vignette. Now this is like a traditional vignette, which I think is actually going to be pretty appropriate with the shot. If I just turn the feather all the way down, we can see, where it is being applied. Now, if you want to adjust the position of the vignette for some reason, you come over here to Open FX Overlay and use this tool here, and then you're able to move the vignette, like the center point of the vignette, wherever you want. So I could just like place it right there if I want to. Come back over here, turn the feathering all the way back up. Actually, I should have done size first. So size, so you can just change how large it is. Aspect ratio, all that good stuff. So pretty standard stuff. This is not necessarily something you need to do in Dehancer. You could, apply it elsewhere if you wanted to as an added effect, but I think I'll keep it. So yeah, I feel like that is looking pretty good. Okay, next option down is film breath. Now this adds some abnormalities into the image, so it's not so clean and perfect frame to frame. And the image kind of like pulses in and out a little bit when you enable this. So I'm just going to go ahead and enable, and let's play this back. And see how like the colors and the light and the contrast and everything is kind of like pulsing, like I was saying before. It just looks a little imperfect. And again, this is the kind of thing that you would probably only want to use if you were really trying to get that authentic film look. Personally, it's not really my thing, but if, it all depends on your project. So for most people, you probably wouldn't want to use it, but it's there if you're really trying to go for that look. Next up, we have gate weave, which is another abnormality setting. This is, attempting to emulate how film would look when like passing through a projector and kind of like skipping around inside of it. Let me just enable both breath and weave here, and you're able to, control how dramatic the effect is. See how when I move that slider back and forth, how the image kind of jumps around a little bit? That's really that's the look. So it kind of depends on, the project, again, whether this is entirely appropriate for what you're doing. But if you're trying to get rid of some of those digital perfections and not get such a clean image, then those options there are obviously available to you. And then down here at the bottom of the panel, we have a few utilities. We have a false color mode that you can enable, which is pretty nice. You're able to then, check the IRE values of, different areas of your image if that's, something you're interested in doing. Then we have this output slider here, which is kind of like one giant opacity slider for everything that you've applied in Dehancer. So for example, like if you, did some color grading work and then you left and you came back and you looked at it later and you thought, wow, I went a little heavy. I wish I could shave like 10% off of that or something. Well, that makes it really easy to do. All right, so what do I think about Dehancer? Well, I think it's a very powerful tool, and I think part of the reason why it's powerful is because it's the kind of thing that you can use as much of or as little of as you want. For example, like if you were, say you're like an experienced colorist and you want to do your own thing, you have your own pipeline going on, you got your own workflow going on with your color grade, and you just want some of those additional added effects, like a little bit of sweetener at the end, a little bit of grain, a little bit of halation, something like that. You can use Dehancer that way. You can just disable all the other stuff. You don't need to apply a film profile and all that if you don't want it. You can just use those special effects. Or if perhaps you're someone who, doesn't really have the interest or perhaps quite frankly the time to be, going deep into color grading in DaVinci, and you're not, that's not really your thing, and you just simply want to color grade some footage, you want to edit some footage and get some good looks quickly by applying some film emulations, have a little bit of a helping hand in the color grading department, and then you're just able to go in and, suit to taste and go in and fine tune the contrast and exposure and, you know, tweak the color a little bit here and there. I mean, yeah, I mean, it is definitely a very approachable and easy way to be, you know, quickly getting some really professional, just some really nice looks out of the plugin. So yeah, I enjoy using it. I think it's a lot of fun to use. I think it's creatively really interesting, and it's fun to experiment with and see what kind of looks you can get with different types of footage and different film stocks as well. So I would definitely recommend downloading it and trying it for yourself if you haven't done so already. There's a link below in the description that you can use in order to download a free trial from Dehancer, install it to DaVinci, give it a shot with your own footage, and see what you think. Thanks again to Dehancer for providing me with a copy of the software. I greatly appreciate it. And that's it for me. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. I will see you in the next video.